Hey, welcome back to part 2 of my disturbing movie Iceberg series. If you missed part 1, then I'd highly suggest that you go check that out, but if you're just here because you want to dive straight into some of the deeper entries on this list, then that's also fair enough, and I'll just give you a really quick recap on what this iceberg actually is, what you can expect, as well as some very brief disclaimers. So this iceberg was fully curated by myself, entirely from my own research, and it basically consists of a selection of films that I and many other people would deem as disturbing. However, as we go further down the iceberg, the films become more niche and progressively more disturbing. This iceberg is not limited to horror films though, and in fact, there's actually a little bit of every genre here, so it's more focused on dark and taboo themes, rather than purely just gore and scare factor, if you will. In part 1, we discussed the first and second tiers, with the first being comprised of what I'd consider to be mainstream and often well-loved films that perhaps just had darker themes, ranging from British dramas such as Fish Tank to cult classic horror films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And the second tier consisted of still somewhat mainstream but was still widely agreed upon as disturbing films like Benny's Video and Tyrannosaur, which, while they're definitely very dark films, they're still directed by big names in the industry and feature some very well-known actors. Today we will be discussing tier 3 of the iceberg, and things definitely start to get pretty up here, but there's still likely to be a few titles that you'll recognize, so I'm very excited to share these ones with you guys today. Before we jump into today's video though, I did just want to give a couple of small disclaimers. First of all, I will be spoiling the films that we discuss today, but there will be timestamps in this video for each film that we talk about. I will try my best to give warnings if I'm giving like really big spoilers for a film, but just keep in mind that this is not a completely spoiler-free video. Also, I just want to make it clear that despite there being some very disturbing and messed up films on this iceberg, especially in the later tiers, I can promise you now that nothing featured on this iceberg is illegal in any way. I feel like a lot of people like to throw around silly statements about disturbing and extreme films being illegal for some reason, and like I know some people do actually include that kind of stuff on their icebergs, but I just want you guys to know that I would never just happily promote anything like that, so I just wanted to clear that up quickly. All of the films, other than some of the ones on the very last tier, can easily be watched online, with a lot of them even being on streaming platforms. There are films later on in this iceberg that I have chosen not to watch, but I will explain why when we get to those tiers, and I'll also be talking about some of my thoughts on extreme underground art cinema, but for now I just want to make it absolutely clear that everything here is very much legal to watch. Okay, now that's out of the way, let's not delay starting this iceberg any longer and just get straight into tier 3. The Poughkeepsie Tapes. The Poughkeepsie Tapes is a documentary-style horror film directed by John Eric Dowdle, in which videotapes are discovered in an abandoned house, which reveal decades worth of evidence against a deranged serial killer. Now, we talk about August Underground later on in the iceberg, and I really can't help but to view this film as like a PG version of that, which like maybe to some people that sounds crazy, but like it is kind of true. Like I'm not really sure what I'd rather watch though, because like this film still manages to be equally as boring as August Underground. This film was shot in just 15 days, which I feel like is starting to become a trend with this iceberg, and many people believe that this film is based on the real-life serial Kendall Francois, who was convicted of 8 women in Poughkeepsie in the 90s, but the director actually just stated that this was just a coincidence, so yeah, that's certainly a very dark coincidence if that's true. The film doesn't really give us any sort of real explanation for the serial killer's motives, which is why I think this film is so disturbing to a lot of people, and to be honest, this film did actually have some potential, and I'm definitely all for a fake documentary horror, but god, this film is so boring, and I'm not really sure why anyone would enjoy this film, to be honest. Like, I don't actually think that this one is that disturbing in the grand scheme of things, but like, I decided to put it on this tier because of the fact that we get no actual explanation for what we're seeing, and it is very, very dark. Like, there are long uncut scenes of an essay, of course, but the film has this weird grainy effect over it, so we can hardly even really make out what we're seeing on screen. Again, very similar to August Underground, which is much further down on this iceberg. This film is certainly very creepy visually, and to be honest, I actually find the screenshots of this film to be creepier than anything else. Like, it definitely has a very haunting, eerie look to it, because the filter makes everyone's faces look really distorted and strange. The Poughkeepsie Tapes certainly has a huge reputation in the horror community because it's very extreme, and with it being a fake documentary, it's obviously made out to seem real, but honestly the acting is just so terrible that I do not buy it whatsoever. The interview sections are just a slog to sit through, and the entire film is just very film student with a budget kind of vibes, but like by budget I literally mean like it wasn't made on 40p. Like, the budget for this film was still clearly minuscule in the grand scheme of things. I do like the grainy home video sections. They're very uncanny valley, very visually pleasing to me. This film would be great though if you're at all interested in post 9/11 films, as it's actually very much explicitly inspired, or perhaps more so influenced, if you will, by 9/11, and it actually becomes quite a significant plot point in the film, which is maybe the only interesting thing about this. I don't know how to feel about this film. I definitely recommend that you watch something like Lake Mungo instead if you want to watch a good fake documentary horror film, as that one is far more convincing and way less boring, because the dialogue in Poughkeepsie Tapes is so terrible that it's actually laughable at times. Is this creepier than Lake Mungo? I don't know. Maybe visually it's certainly a bit more disturbing, but Lake Mungo's story is way more terrifying to me, and in comparison to this movie, it just makes Poughkeepsie look like pure trash. The Piano Teacher. Hey, so I don't think that's the type of fingering that they teach at music school. In tier 2 of this iceberg, we had both Isabelle Huppert featuring in a film, and a couple of Michael Haneke's films as well. But what happens when they joined forces to create something together? Well, luckily or unluckily, depending on how you look at it, Michael Haneke directed the erotic film The Piano Teacher, featuring Isabelle Huppert in the main role as Erica, and as a result, they produced one of the most disturbing depictions of oppression to ever be put to screen. Our main character, Erica, is a piano teacher who lives with her very strict and domineering mother, who is also kind of the voice of reason for the film, but she's incredibly controlling and traps Erica within this suffocating loop of oppression. Erica meets a young man named Walter, who she begins to romantically and pursue. It's based on the 1983 novel of the same name by Elfriede Jelinek, and this film adaptation won the Grand Prix. Fun fact, we talked about funny games in the last part of this Iceberg series, and originally Michael Haneke actually wanted Isabelle Huppert to star in that, which I can totally see, to be honest, but this time around, Haneke basically wouldn't take no for an answer, because he straight up refused to even direct The Piano Teacher unless she starred in it. This film is particularly shocking because it is very graphic. This includes Erica self-pleasuring herself with a razor blade and herself, as well as very long uncut scenes of However, despite its shocking nature, this has often been regarded as Isabelle Huppert's best performance in a film, and it has even been quoted as one of the best movies of all time. One of the really shocking aspects of this film is the relationship that Erica has with her mother, as she is completely suffocated by her to the point that she kind of dictates Erica's entire impression of what life is in general, and she is even depicted as sleeping in the same bed as her, and at one point, even essaying her own mother. Interestingly though, they're hardly ever actually shown in the same room during their scenes of dialogue, so whenever we do actually see them physically near each other, it creates a fiercely tense and unpleasant atmosphere. As well as this, Erica's relationship with Walter is particularly disturbing, as it's basically a depiction of sadomasochism, with Erica even writing Walter a letter at one point, like detailing in graphic detail what she wants him to do to her, and that's the only kind of contact she wants with him, and anything else, like, she's not interested, which makes him very frustrated throughout the film. The original author of The Piano Teacher actually based the character of Erica's mother on his own mother, which is perhaps what makes her feel so realistic and terrifying, as she oppresses Erica to the point that it feels as if Erica has kind of lost her own identity. The staging of this film is really interesting and clever when it comes to Erica and her mother, as there's always some sort of physical space or distance between them, despite the implied suffocation that Erica suffers from living with her. Something that made Isabelle Huppert all the more perfect for this role was the fact that she actually studied piano for 12 years, and she picked this hobby back up specifically for this film. The Piano Teacher truly shows us how constant monitoring and policing of one's life can psychologically affect them, the deep-rooted trauma that this causes, and the brutal consequences. Erica appears to be completely numb as her trauma and desire merges into one conflicting emotion. Michael Haneke is truly such an innovative director. He is so perfect at capturing pure visceral bleakness, and paired with Isabelle Huppert, it is honestly a masterpiece of film that you won't be able to forget, or perhaps even finish at all. It is disgusting. I don't even know if I can say that I like this film, because that feels wrong, and it poses a lot of deep, controversial questions that I unfortunately don't think that there are any easy answers to. This one is definitely crossing the line for a lot of people, as it leaves you feeling utterly violated and appalled at what you're seeing on screen. There are a lot of different ways that you could interpret this film, which is what makes it so interesting, as it suggests the dynamics of power, whilst also exploring psychosexuality and even voyeurism. Because of Erica's oppression, the only real idea that she has of what should be is from adult films in shops, which obviously suggests where she gets the inspiration for her sadomasochism. The Piano Teacher is much darker than something like Funny Games, because any kind of entertainment value is essentially stripped from this film, and instead we are just forced to watch Erica and her young student Walter as they engage in sick games, and we're not really sure how we're meant to feel about Erica as a person, because she is such a realistic depiction of someone who is deeply troubled rather than simply just good or bad. Is this film shock for shock's sake? I'm honestly not sure. I lean more towards yes, but I also don't know if that's completely a bad thing when it comes to this film. Climax. Climax is a horror film directed by Gaspar Noé about a group of dancers who gather to rehearse and party. However, their night suddenly takes a turn for the worse when they discover that their drinks have been laced with LSD. This film is very experimental, and it is loosely based on a true story in which a French dance troupe in the 90s had their drinks spiked with LSD whilst at a party. According to Gaspar Noé, Climax is, and I quote, all about people creating something together and failing in the second half. It's like the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. Mankind can create big things, and then with the influence of alcohol or some accident, everything falls. I remember as a teenager when I was 14, I would host parties at my home, and I liked sangria. It was the first alcohol I ever drank. But you seriously don't need drugs to lose control. Alcohol is more than enough. I've seen so many more fights linked to alcohol. It can turn you crazy. The cast of this film are mostly comprised of professional dancers with no prior acting experience, and once again, the film was shot in just 15 days within an abandoned school in Paris, and it was almost entirely improvised. Of course, Gaspar Noé had the idea of the basic plot, but the film was unrehearsed with no written dialogue, and they also didn't even know how the film was going to end. Gaspar Noé also took a very experimental approach when it came to depicting the effect that the had on the characters, stating that, and I quote, I didn't want to do any visual or sound effects to reproduce the feeling you are having when you're on drugs. I thought it would be funny to do it the other way, like shoot almost documentary style with long cuts, seeing how the effects of and alcohol are experienced, how it's seen from the outside, like how it all shows and not how it feels. Climax has an incredible soundtrack featuring artists such as Daft Punk, Aphex Twin and Soft Cell, and the film won the Art Cinema Award at Cannes Film Festival. Something that I absolutely love about this film is that it's actually split into two parts, with the credits only rolling 40 minutes into the film, which literally gave me chills when I first watched it, because it's kind of letting you know that shit is about to get crazy, which it certainly does. All of the characters begin to completely trip out, including a child who is also present at the party. Climax is one long nightmare, which I desperately need to rewatch because I'm sure that there are things that I missed out on because this film is so hectic. The last portion of this film is also done in one continuous shot, and it is full of all sorts of colours, flashing lights, guttural screaming, and intense camera movements to really heighten your anxiety. I really need to familiarise myself with more of Gaspar Noé's work because I absolutely loved this one. The narcoleptic imagery is pure madness, and it really makes you feel as if you've just been transported straight into hell. Climax also has some of the best dance choreography I've ever seen put to screen, with all of the dancers' movements being so satisfyingly fluid. It's almost like if Possession, the film, was like a musical, which actually Gaspar Noé was quite openly inspired by, with like the DVD case for it even being very visible in the like opening part with the interviews, as well as Suspiria. So it is kind of like those two films if they're like a musical. I have no clue why a child was involved in this party, but he certainly adds to the already stressful environment, that's for sure. Antichrist. Antichrist is a horror film by Lars von Trier, and it follows a couple played by Willem Dafoe and Charlotte Gainsbourg, who are simply just referred to as he and she. After their young son tragically dies from a fatal accident in which he falls out of a window, the grieving couple retreat to a cabin in the woods, which, first mistake, like, come on. Don't go to a cabin in the woods in a horror film, first big mistake. And from here on out, the film devolves into complete chaos and madness as the couple attempt to repair their broken marriage. And well, have you guys seen that clip of Cannibal Corpse?
It's a fun little song about shooting blood from your cock.
Yeah, that's basically what happens, and that very lost and confused security guard in the clip. That's me. That was me watching this film. Willem Dafoe's character is a therapist in this film, and his goal is to try and treat his wife using psychotherapy. However, she begins to believe that all women are evil, and Willem Dafoe concludes that her greatest fear is Satan. So yeah, this whole working on a broken marriage thing isn't quite going to plan, and they end up fighting, which they often do via intercourse for some reason, and Charlotte Gainsbourg proceeds to smash a block of wood onto Willem Dafoe's penis, and that's when he does the whole She then drills a hole through his leg and bolts a heavy grindstone through the wound, and then later cuts off her own This is a truly polarizing film, and it is so explicit. All of the effects are scarily realistic. Like, if you showed me some of these scenes out of context, especially the music ones, then I genuinely think that they were real. It never cuts away from any of the truly gory scenes, and it's also a very explicit film as well, with all of the scenes being completely unsimulated. Something that I do actually find pretty hilarious about this film is that Willem Dafoe was like, he was completely fine with participating in any nudity and even the unsimulated scenes. However, they ended up using a body double because they said his anatomy was so large that it was distracting. So yeah, there's a fun fact for you. I just think that's extremely funny. I don't know. Unsurprisingly, John Waters absolutely loved this film and said it was one of the best films to come out of 2009, which, like, I find offensive because Coraline and Up came out that same year, and, like, those are obviously comparable to Antichrist, so Antichrist did win the Best Cinematographer Award at the European Film Awards, which I do think was deserved because it is a beautiful looking film, as well as Charlotte Gainsbourg winning the Best Actress Award at Cannes Film Festival. There was actually meant to be a video game for this film, but it sadly got cancelled, which is a shame because I would have loved to have seen what that would have entailed, especially as it was meant to be a first-person psychological horror in the style of Silent Hill, so that is truly a shame. Lars von Trier wrote this film after spending 2 months in a mental hospital for severe depression, and it is the first installment for his trilogy of depression, which was quickly followed up by Melancholia and Nymphomaniac. Is this film a bold artistic masterpiece exploring depression? Or is it just a gratuitous piece of shock value? It's hard to say, and it's definitely a big debate when it comes to discussions of this film because it is so intensely violent. If you're considering watching this one, then just keep in mind everything that I've said and don't say I didn't warn you. The Sadness. The Sadness is a horror film directed by Rob Jabars about zombie-like beings who find the ultimate joy and satisfaction in sadness and depravity. The film follows Jim as he desperately attempts to be reunited with his girlfriend Kat after the outbreak occurs. The super disturbing aspect of this film is that although it's kind of marketed as a zombie film, the zombie outbreak isn't actually a zombie outbreak. Instead, it's a strange infection which makes people's repressed emotions and intrusive thoughts impossible to ignore. The best depiction of this in the film is probably near the beginning, in which Kat is on a subway train and there's this super creepy pervy old man who keeps making really awkward and progressively more creepy comments. However, once he becomes infected with the virus, he just says and does everything that's on his mind. His horrifically misogynistic and vulgar comments throughout the film are somehow equally as disturbing as the super gore-heavy visuals, and he kind of acts as the main villain throughout the film. He's actually the perpetrator of perhaps the most infamous scene in this film, which you might have heard of, but basically during the subway scene, he stabs a stranger named Molly in the eye using his umbrella, and later on in the film, he Molly in this same wound. So yeah, these zombies enact upon all of their darkest desires, and the other super dark scene for this film is one in which Kat discovers a doctor who's basically been injecting newborn babies with the virus to try and find like an antibody, and once he becomes infected, he admits to her that he enjoyed like the newborn. It's really messed up. Despite how controversial this film is, it did go on to be awarded Best Picture at Fantastic Fest. I have to admit that I love this film. I love this film. Like, to me, it just feels like one of those super over-the-top splatterpunk books, but put to film, which is something that you really don't see a lot, especially not one with as big as a budget as this one. And to be honest, I think the comparison to a splatterpunk book is pretty fair, as this film was actually inspired by the extreme comic book series entitled Crossed. I love that this isn't just like any other zombie film, and I love how sadistic and crazy it is, and it really does quench my thirst for gore, if you will. It definitely has a super nasty, dark, comedic tone at times, and this film is explicit in every way possible, from the dialogue to the gory visuals to the super extended scenes. I really do recommend this one if you love over-the-top gore, because this one is a wild ride, and despite its extremely dark themes, it's actually a surprisingly fun film, which is what makes me love this one so much. Mysterious Skin. Mysterious Skin is a thriller film directed by Greg Araki, based on Scott Himes' 1995 novel, and right off the bat, I'm giving a spoiler warning for this one because I really do think that you should just go into this one blind if you haven't already. My spoiler-free summary for this film, though, is that it follows two separate young men who lead seemingly very different lives, one of them being a gay and the other being deeply obsessed with alien invasions after he believes that he was abducted as a child. Honestly, if this sounds like interesting to you, then don't even look up this film. Just go into it blind, because a lot of like summaries, even on like Letterboxd, will just like spoil it. So just go into this one blind with that tiny summary I gave you. But if you're not interested and rather just have me spoil it, then here you go. Stick around. This film, at its core, is a depiction of how different people cope with trauma, with this film focusing in on childhood sexual assault. Both Neil and Brian were abused by their little league coach, and later on, when they are both 15 years old, we see Neil as he is now a worker, and Brian, who is convinced that as a child he was abducted by aliens, when in reality this traumatic alien abduction that he remembers is actually just his own mind protecting him from the harsh reality of the situation. The two boys eventually cross paths as Brian essentially becomes convinced that Neil was abducted with him. The particularly shocking aspect of this film is that we see a lot of flashbacks in which the assault takes place, and whilst we don't technically see anything on screen, the implications are bad enough. enough. This is such a devastating coming-of-age film which stars Joseph Gordon-Levitt as Neil, who really has such an incredible performance in this film. It was given an NC-17 rating, even though the studio attempted to appeal this, but they were ultimately unsuccessful. There were actually lots of child safety protocols put into place for this film though, and during production, Greg Araki was very careful as to not let the child actors actually understand the implications of the scenes that they were starring in, and of course they didn't actually have to do anything inappropriate for the film. This is a heavy watch, but it is undeniably beautiful with its very unique depictions of trauma. It is truly a masterpiece, and although it is a deeply disturbing film, it's also very tender at times. That being said, this film is definitely not a romanticized story of child abuse whatsoever, and it does an impeccable job at making it appear as horrifying as it should be depicted. Mysterious Skin made me feel emotions that I've never felt before when watching a film, and I was really heartbroken after finishing this one. It's very taboo, and I do love the majority of this film. However, there are some scenes that I personally think could have been left out. Like, towards the end of the film, we see Neil as he is violently in a bathtub by one of his customers, and I really think this scene just takes away from how respectfully and carefully the rest of the film was made. But anyways, I find it so interesting that Greg Araki chose to portray one of these boys as hypersexual whilst the other is seemingly completely asexual, and I think that is something that makes the connection between Neil and Brian once they are reunited so special, as well as the very close friendship that Brian forms with one of Neil's friends, Eric. In fact, I actually think that Eric and Brian's friendship is my favourite aspect of the film because it's incredibly wholesome despite the dark narrative of the film. The Girl Next Door. Perhaps you've heard of the horrific 1960s case of Sylvia Likens, a 16-year-old girl who was tortured and eventually murdered at the hands of her caregiver Gertrude, whose own children as well as the very young neighbourhood boys all participated in Sylvia's death. This is one of the most horrific recorded cases of child abuse, as Sylvia was beaten, humiliated, and raped, which Gertrude only encouraged, and this lasted for 3 long months, until Sylvia eventually died the result of both her extensive injuries and malnourishment. There have been many pieces of media that were inspired by this case, with one of the most well-known examples being Jack Ketchum's 1989 novel entitled The Girl Next Door, which would later be adapted to screen in 2007 by Gregory Wilson, not to be confused with An American Crime, which also released the same year and was closely based on that same story. However, what stands out about The Girl Next Door is that it is very explicit in nature, to the point that the lead actress who plays Meg in the film, who is meant to represent Sylvia in the story, actually said that this role took both physical and mental tolls on her health because of the abuse scenes in which she would be tied up and blindfolded. The performances in this film are pretty solid, however I kind of wish that they weren't, because it just makes this film all the more grueling and traumatic to sit through, as its atmosphere is so disturbing, and many critics have shown outright disapproval for the film because it is so explicit. Funnily enough, Stephen King actually praised this movie for these exact reasons though, but I don't know, I'm pretty torn on this film personally. I don't feel like it was spreading awareness whatsoever, and rather it was just shock for shock's sake, especially because they changed quite a few aspects of the original Sylvia Likens case, including a weird kind of romance story between Meg and one of the boys, and they kind of show him being remorseful and trying to help her, when in reality, none of these boys seem to give one shit about her, and they pretty happily abused her. So I think adding in that aspect is actually pretty weird, and honestly kind of up. Apparently in the book, this boy was actually meant to kind of represent Jack Ketchum's own shock and horror, basically kind of self-inserting himself into the narrative, but I just don't think this comes across in the film whatsoever, and to be honest, turning this into a horror film in general just feels wrong. Like, it just kind of gives me the ick. Nonetheless, this adaptation is beyond harrowing, and it genuinely disturbed me when I watched it, as well as making me incredibly angry, and honestly, I never want to watch this film ever again. The scenes are some of the worst I've seen. Julien Donkey-Boy. Julien Donkey-Boy is an experimental drama film directed by Harmony Korine about a young schizophrenic boy and his abusive and dysfunctional family. This film utilizes many experimental filmmaking techniques, including stop-motion photography, parallel cuts, and still photographs, and it was actually the first American film to be made in accordance with the rules of Dogma 95, which was basically a filmmaking movement founded by Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg, which were basically just rules to create a film as an attempt to take back power for the directors as artists. However, saying that, Harmony Korine did actually break a few of these rules in Julien Donkey-Boy, including the use of hidden cameras that are technically not handheld, even though Dogma 95 states that you must only use handheld cameras. However, it was still endorsed by the original Dogma 95 committee, despite these rules being broken. With that being said, it's probably not too surprising that this is an utterly bizarre film, but it does have some big names in it, such as Chloe Sevigny, who for some reason is in like every disturbing film on this list. That wasn't on purpose, I swear. Overall, this film is about a young, troubled man attempting to navigate life whilst also trying to deal with his incredibly broken family, and nearly all of the dialogue for this film is improvised, which makes it feel very authentic. And the main character of Julien was actually inspired by Harmony Korine's own schizophrenic uncle, and Julien's actor studied audio tapes of Korine's uncle to prepare for his role in the film. As well as this, Harmony Korine's actual grandmother plays the grandmother in the film, so you can see how this film comes across as being so realistic despite being deeply experimental at the same time. This film is now considered as one of Harmony Korine's best films, and Ewan Bremer as Julien is truly such a captivating performance that you can't forget. Happiness. Happiness may well be the most misleading film title ever, and it somehow only makes it worse that this one is also a comedy. When you hear terms such as disturbing or extreme in relation to a movie, what genre do you associate that with? Probably horror or maybe even a dark drama, right? Well, perhaps you'd be surprised to find out that there are actually a fair few disturbing movies that are also comedies. Now, I know that we've already discussed Jackass, which is indeed a comedy movie, but I think most people watching Jackass know what they're in for, whereas Happiness markets itself as, well, a happy comedy film following the lives of different individuals who are also loosely connected through the lives of three sisters. But what lays beyond the surface of Happiness is so much more, and it is so much darker than it initially appears to be. The film explores many taboo topics such as bourgeoisie, suburban dysfunction, and depression, and it was considered to be so taboo that the original studio that was meant to be releasing the film straight up refused. I really do recommend going into this one blind, but I am going to be spoiling the film now, so please, if it interests you, then go watch it, but if you'd rather someone else just explains it for you, then stick around. One of the sisters, named Trish, is married to Bill, and they have 3 children together. However, Bill has a secret. He's a and he has an obsession with one of his young son's classmates who is just 11 years old. This is the film's most disturbing narrative in my opinion. The film does not hold back from showing us the gritty details of what goes on between this and young child. Another sister named Helen is being constantly harassed and threatened by a man named Alan, who makes phone calls to her describing in explicit detail what he's going to do to her. The film is very explicit, not only with its dialogue here, but also with its visuals, as Alan is truly, he's something to behold. He is pathetic and vile, and they do a great job at making you absolutely disgusted by him in every way. Then there's Joy, who also gets targeted by Alan via phone calls, but as well as this, she is also just generally a very sensitive character, and is constantly criticized by her older sisters. Her own students don't like her, and she is just treated awfully by those around her. This film was, and honestly still is, so controversial because of its subject matter being so incredibly dark, especially with its portrayal of whilst you technically never actually see anything on screen, the implications are still so horrific to watch. Some of the dialogue is truly so horrific, as Bill also grooms his child Billy, and the conversations that we hear between them, especially towards the end of the film, are traumatic. Like, they are so traumatizing to sit through. It's genuinely like the most disturbing piece of dialogue that I've heard to this day. Sundance Film Festival actually straight up refused to show this film, and it also received an NC-17 rating, which made the the film's distribution super limited. However, both VHS and DVD copies of the film were released fairly quickly, but to this day the film cannot be accessed via any streaming platforms because it is considered to be so controversial. Still, 28 years later, I have to say that this one did actually shock me. Like, it had me pausing the film multiple times and saying out loud, what the is going on? I can almost guarantee you that this one is a hard watch. Although if this one has you wondering how it was ever greenlit, then just know that as we go down this iceberg, the film somehow gets so much worse than this. Happiness still has some crazy big actors in it, such as Jane Addams, Philip Seymour Hoffman and Dylan Baker, whose performances are truly so convincing that it will make you feel sick to the core. That being said, this is a comedy film still, which will probably only make you feel even worse, because if you find yourself laughing at any of the absurd dialogue in this film, then it will likely only make you feel even more empty and upset with yourself, which is exactly how Todd Solondz, who directed this film, wants you to feel. So unfortunately, I really highly doubt that you'll be feeling happiness after watching this film, and instead you'll likely be left feeling extremely awkward and perhaps even in your very own pit of despair. Happiness is one of the strangest and most unique films I've ever watched. Maybe don't watch this one for a family movie night though. Kids. Kids is a drama film directed by Larry Clark, and this one was actually written by Harmony Korine, and it shows. This film aims to be as shocking, depraved, and sickening as possible, which is already bad enough, but then you also realise that the actors and characters in this film are so young. I mean, as the title suggests, they're only kids. It follows a group of bored kids and teens in New York City, but we have particular focus on the characters of Telly and Casper, with Telly being one of the most revolting characters I have ever seen in a film, as his favourite pastime is what he refers to as deflowering virgins, but he progressively aims for younger and younger girls. This is a very independent film, and to be honest, I don't think that any big studios would have taken it up anyways, because it is so explicit to the point that it doesn't even feel like it should be legal to watch at times. Obviously it is though, and whilst it's not really on any streaming sites for obvious reasons, it is quite a well-known film, and I think it's more of its tone more than anything that's really off-putting. Chloe Sevigny is once again featured in this film, and after watching this, I can never look at her the same, as she plays the character of Jenny, who's only slept with one boy, with that being Telly, and we see her getting tested for an STD, and she tests positive for HIV. She spends almost the entirety of the film just trying to track down Telly, who we know is currently attempting to initiate encounters with very young girls. However, whilst trying to track him down, Jenny ends up getting spiked at a club, so by the time that she reaches Telly, who is at a house party, it's already too late and she passes out on the sofa. The ending to this film genuinely really shocked me though, as in the morning, Casper Jenny while she is still unconscious, and not only that, but they are also surrounded by a bunch of passed out kids from the party, including very young children who can't be over the age of 10. This scene is uncut, it's long, it's horrific. Larry Clark stated that I wanted to present the way kids see things, but without all this baggage, this morality that these old middle-aged Hollywood guys bring to it. Kids don't think that way. They're living in the moment, not thinking about anything beyond that, and that's what I wanted to catch. The film features authentic New York City street kids with no previous acting experience, and Harmony Korine actually wrote this film at just 19 years old. Kids is set over a single 24-hour period, and more than anything, it really does just drive home how terrifying it is to be a woman, in my opinion. Like, this film just had me so angry at all of the men depicted in this, but especially Telly and Casper, of course. This one really disturbed me. Come and See. Come and See is a war film directed by L.M. Klimov, which documents the cruelest aspects of war, as it depicts the invasion of a village in Belarus by German forces, and a young boy named Florian is sent into the forest to join the resistance fighters. He meets a girl named Glasha who accompanies him back to his village. However, once they return home, he discovers that his family have been brutally massacred. Come and See is a Soviet epic, which is ultimately a piece of anti-war media, which displays only the most horrific and harsh sides of war, and this is a brutal film from start to end. The filming for this movie actually couldn't begin for a whole 8 years because the State Committee for Cinematography wouldn't accept the screenplay as they deemed it to be too realistic, as well as stating that it was propaganda for the aesthetics of dirtiness and naturalism. However, once filming began, it was shot in chronological order over 9 months, and Alexei Kravchenko, who plays Floria, said that he underwent debilitating fatigue and hunger whilst filming. Come and See is such a harrowing portrayal of war, and according to Alem Klimov, the film was so shocking that literal ambulances were called in to take away particularly impressionable audience members. It is a very artsy film though, and it's actually not that graphic, and its disturbing nature more so comes from its nightmarish tones, as it's quite a poetic and expressionistic film, which really is just an unforgettable watch. It's devastating, and yet it has often been considered as one of the greatest films ever made, including Empire magazine ranking it at number 60 for its list of the 500 greatest movies of all time. Fortunately, after Come and See, Klimov didn't actually make any more films, as he said that he completely lost interest after creating this one. This is easily one of the most powerful films ever, which focuses on the occupation of Belarusia and its use of real live ammunition, and its genuinely grueling production is perhaps what makes this film feel all the more frightening, with Alexei Kravchenko even almost being hit by the live ammunition multiple times. He was a non-professional actor and was just 13 years old when he was cast for the lead role in the film. Completely natural lighting and fast film stock was also used for the film, which is what gives it that raw and grainy look that the film is so well known for. Originally, the film was actually meant to be titled Kill Him, but this was forcibly changed by Soviet censors, and so Come and See was instead chosen from the biblical book of Revelation. Something even more horrifying about this film is it's actually based on real accounts, as it was inspired directly from the 1978 book entitled I Am from the Fiery Village, which compiled survivor accounts of the destruction of Belarusian villages. I feel as if anyone who is pro-war should watch this film to really understand that war ultimately just causes more harm than good, including unspeakable harm to young innocent children, as this film depicts. Come and See is cold and it's ruthless, which is bound to have almost anyone at a loss for words, especially with just how captivating Alexei Kravchenko's performance is. He literally looks as if he's aged by like 20 years by the end of the film, and the suffering that is shown throughout this is so tough to stomach. Everything that Floria is put through is so utterly dehumanizing, and you literally see him losing his soul throughout the film. It's a film that you can only watch once, as it is pure nightmare fuel, and yet it is somehow a simultaneously beautiful film with outstanding sound design, as well as Alexei Rodionov's cinematography being some of the best I've ever seen. There are a lot of close-ups of people's faces to show their turmoil and suffering, and it is the ultimate portrayal of trauma. An absolute masterpiece that I probably should have watched sooner, as it really is breathtaking, and I think everyone should watch it at least once in their lives. Martyrs. Martyrs is a horror film which follows 2 young women named Lucy and Anna as they seek revenge against Lucy's kidnappers, who horrifically her as a child. Big spoiler warning for this one, as there is a massive plot twist, so go check this one out for yourself if you're interested in new French extremity at all, because this is perhaps one of the best and most iconic that the genre has to offer. This is a psychological horror which Pascal Loyer wrote during a period in which he was incredibly and upon release, this film was heavily polarizing and even condemned by critics because of its controversial nature. Pascal Loyer stated that he wanted the audience to be able to feel real pain whilst watching his film, and it not only contains super graphic violence, but it also makes an effort to psychologically hurt the viewers themselves, as we are forced to witness the brutal of characters. Martyrs is Pascal Loyer's second film after his debut film House of Voices, which I haven't watched by the way, so you guys will have to let me know if it's any good. And Martyrs was rejected by all the big French studios, as well as by actresses, because of how graphic and relentlessly dark the film gets. Pascal Loyer actually had Mylène Jampanois, who plays Lucy, watch the 1981 film Possession, as well as the 1978 Halloween film, as inspiration for her performance. However, However, she actually really struggled with playing this role, stating that every night when I went back to my room, I just cried because I was so physically and psychologically tired. All my scenes are violent. Okay, I'm gonna really spoil the film now, so just skip ahead to the next film if you don't want any massive spoilers. So Lucy married the entire family that had abused her as a child, including the family's young children, and Anna is absolutely horrified by the carnage that Lucy has just committed, but she decides to help Lucy nonetheless. However, Lucy is clearly very deeply troubled as she keeps hallucinating and in progressively more and more violent ways until eventually she runs outside and kills herself by her own throat. The next day, Anna discovers a secret passageway in the house which leads to an extremely sinister looking chamber, along with a woman who has a steel blindfold across her face which has been stapled to her skull, which Anna removes, but the woman begins to herself with a knife before a group of people arrive at the house, kill the woman and capture Anna, telling her that they are attempting to create what they call martyrs, as they believe that once a victim has had enough systematic torture, then their suffering will eventually result in transcendental insight into the afterlife. We then see Anna being before she is completely alive for the final stage of martyrdom. The special effects makeup in this film is some of the best I've ever seen, especially Anna's makeup once she is alive, of course. However, the film's special effects designer Benoit Lestang actually sadly committed prior to the film's release, which is really unfortunate because he was clearly a very talented artist and I wish that we could have seen more of his work. The film's score is also really good and creepy, as it just has this super eerie ambience which only further adds to the unsettling and disturbing nature of the film. Upon its release, it was actually reported that a man collapsed during one of the screenings of the film, as well as a woman vomiting. In France, the film was incredibly controversial and it received an 18+ rating, which, if you didn't know, is actually very extreme in France, with Lawyer even explaining that, and I quote, "In France, when you get an 18+ rating, your film is dead. It's like XXX. It was a way for them to censor me without asking me to cut anything." So we fought a lot and I was supported by all the unions of the French film industry. I was very surprised. It was a matter of principle, even for the people who didn't like the movie. It was a matter of freedom of speech and expression. I actually own the special edition Umbrella Entertainment Blu-ray of this film, so yeah, I just wanted to share that because I think that's pretty cool and I really like the cover. I just wanted to show that off, basically. It definitely fits into the category. However, it also has an actual narrative and both lead roles are pretty engaging, and I'd say the film is still pretty exhilarating and fun to watch, even if it is super dark and gnarly at times. It does actually have a US remake, but I haven't watched it as it looks really to be honest, but let me know if you've seen it and what you thought of it, I guess. Actually, Lawyer was really vocally unhappy about this film, which I didn't know until now, but I guess it makes sense, with him saying that, and I quote, "I had a bad contract. I didn't even get paid for it. That's really the only thing I regret in my career, that my name is now associated with such a junk film and I didn't even get a cent for it. I tried to watch it but only got through 20 minutes. It was like watching my mother get Then I stopped. Life is too short. In the American system, a movie like Martyrs is just not possible. They saw my movie and then turned it into something completely uninteresting." Honestly, I really appreciate him being so open and honest about this, because I can imagine that it really does suck to just have something that you worked so hard on just being ripped off like this. Anyways, the original Martyrs has often been heralded as one of the greatest horror films of all time, including IGN ranking it at number 32 out of a list of 100 films, as well as Rolling Stone similarly ranking it at number 36. If you're looking for a philosophical horror film, then this is the film for you. The character of Mademoiselle is truly so unnerving. Martyrs is brutal throughout, and it deserves its reputation in the disturbing film community, as it really does explore humanity's true evil, trauma, and ultimate depravity. It also has some of my favourite body horror ever, which is really terrifying terrifying to look at and genuinely makes me shiver. This is a film that you can't forget because it's so upsetting and bleak, and it's sure to ruin your entire week as it leaves you with many existential questions which the film doesn't ever give you the answers to, which is why I think this film is such a masterpiece. It's probably a film that you should only watch once, although I'm not going to recommend this one as it's pretty brutal, and unless you're into extreme horror then you're probably not going to like this one. Martyrs is also perhaps the best post-colonial horror film out there, and it just once again proves that when it comes to horror, the French are truly goated at making it as crazy and insane as possible. Requiem for a Dream. Requiem for a Dream is a horror film directed by Darren Aronofsky, which follows 4 fairly loosely connected individuals who all struggle against drug addiction in differing ways, and throughout the film we see their addictions worsening to the point of no return. Requiem for a Dream uses psychological drama elements to depict its story, and it stars some pretty huge names in it, including Jared Leto as Harry. Aronofsky stated that, and I quote, "Requiem for a Dream is not about or the Harry Tyrone Marion story is a very traditional story, but putting it side by side with the Sarah story, we suddenly say, oh my god, what is it? The idea that the same inner monologue goes through a person's head when they're trying to quit, as with cigarettes, as when they're trying to not eat food so they can lose 20 pounds, was really fascinating to me. I thought it was an idea that we hadn't seen on film, and I wanted to bring it up on the screen. The film is inspired by the 1978 novel of the same name by Hubert Selby Jr., and upon adapting the film, Darren Aronofsky really quite struggled with finding an actress to play the character of Sarah, as many rejected the role because of her particularly harrowing storyline. In the film, Sarah is a widow living alone in a Brighton Beach apartment, and her favourite pastime is watching TV. One day, she receives a call informing her that she has been invited to appear on her favourite game show, although it seems as though this call is a scam or even a delusion. However, it doesn't really matter, Sarah falls for it either way, and one of her close friends recommends that she should visit a physician to prescribe her amphetamines to control her appetite with the goal of losing weight before her appearance on the game show. Her son Harry, who is a addict, quickly recognizes that his own mother is also clearly struggling with abuse. However, when he confronts her about this, she essentially explains that this game show appearance is her last reason to keep on living. From this point onwards, her condition only worsens as she becomes increasingly frantic and delusional until she is ultimately admitted to the psychiatric ward. However, after her treatment, it leaves her in a catatonic state of dissociation. In preparation for Jared Leto's role as Harry, he actually spent some time living on the streets of New York and surrounded himself with real. As well as this, real were actually included as extras for some scenes of the film, with Darren Aronofsky even recalling that some of these extras were literally themselves whilst on set. This film's visuals are absolutely insane and super captivating to watch, as it includes many rapid cuts and montages, and whenever the characters are seen using street, we are shown a super rapid montage to represent their intoxication, with these shots including extreme close-ups as well as extreme distance to cause a really nauseating effect on the viewer. Requiem for a Dream features the very infamous Lux Eterna soundtrack, which I'm sure you've heard, but if not then just look it up because obviously I can't show it here due to copyright, but it is so effective at communicating the complete disarray and hopelessness of the characters in this film. So unsurprisingly, the film was slapped with the NC-17 rating as a result of its unflinching look into and it's often been compared to Trainspotting, but as its much less comedic counterpart of course, and honestly I absolutely love both of these films. Requiem for a Dream has some of the best editing I've ever seen, which really portrays the despair of addiction and the deterioration of the characters as a result. It's been said to examine the collapse of the American dream as well. Perhaps one of my favourite aspects of this film is a refrigerator which Tom and Sarah and actually moves, which I just think is so cool and creative. Marlon Wayans plays Harry's close friend Tyrone, who has connections to a and his role in this film is so impeccable, even if it is just a fairly small role, including a deleted scene in which he mentions that he lost his mother at just 8 years old, which I'd argue actually adds a lot more context and humanity to his character. But of course, Ellen Burstyn as Sarah is just phenomenal, and the ways in which she depicts Sarah's obsession with the red dress which she wore to Harry's graduation and her desperation to be able to fit into it for the game show is so harrowing to watch, as we know that really deep down the dress is merely a representation of her now deceased husband, highlighting the pit of loneliness that she finds herself in as a widow, as her son is a who is constantly stealing for her for money, and her friends clearly don't actually give a shit about her because they literally tell her to start diet pills to lose weight rather than actually supporting her when she's clearly struggling. Jennifer Connelly plays Harry's girlfriend Marion, who's clearly genuinely in love with him. However, she ultimately ends up as a to make more money to fuel Harry's, which only ends Harry up in an incredibly dark place, as he ends up losing his arm due to his use, turning his arm gangrenous, essentially implying that Marion's trauma that she goes through for Harry is rendered useless and completely unnecessary. This is another one of those films that you should probably only watch once, and it may be one of the most genuinely frightening horror films ever, and it will certainly make you never want to participate in use whatsoever. This might be one of the best anti-PSAs, as it truly is just tragic, as we see each character desperately hoping that they can get by in life purely by, well, just hoping. Requiem for a Dream will have you needing to touch grass after watching it because it is sure to ruin your day. Okay, that is everything on tier 3. Next time we'll be going over tier 4, and the films are only going to get a lot darker than this, so make sure to subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I'd really appreciate it, and stick around for the next part because I'm very excited to go over tier 4 with you guys. There's some great, very disturbing films on there. This is the second time I'm filming this because I forgot to plug in my microphone the first time because I'm so smart like that. So pray for me that this footage is fine or I'm gonna crash out. But yeah, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!